All right, hello students. I want to go over with those of you at home how to set up a paragraph responding to the topic 3 prompt. I've gone ahead and put the prompt up here in front of you, and I went ahead and separated the precursor there with the actual question. So the progressives attempted to use the government to address the problems brought on by industrial capitalism, urbanization, and political corruption. And that's the way the standard kind of lays it out in those three categories. But the question I ask is, to what extent were the progressives successful in creating a more fair and just society? Now, normally a prompt like this, you could actually take three options. You could accept it, you could refute it, or you could modify it. So you could say they were successful, they were not successful, or that they were somewhat successful, right, in some ways and in others. If we're going to continue to use the same standard setup for an argumentative paragraph that we did in the previous prompt, we're really only looking at accepting or refuting the prompt. So you're either going to say progressives were by and large successful, or they were not by and large successful. As usual, the first part of the prompt, though, can very easily be turned into your context statement. So when we take a look here at the argument builder, remember in the upper right-hand side is where we start with context. We need that first sentence laying the groundwork, setting the stage where we are before we go into the thesis here. And so what I'm going to focus on today is I'm going to give you a little bit of a context statement, just taking part of the prompt, and then kind of help set up a thesis by examining some evidence that can be used to answer this both in the positive and the negative. So when we zero in here on the context, what's going on in history, we've got problems brought on by industrialization, urbanization, and government corruption, and progressives in the early 20th century are taking steps to address those problems or to resolve those problems. And so you just want to kind of lay out what we're talking about here, which is progressives and their reforms and that they're addressing these problems, and then your assessment. Are they successful, or were they successful? Were they not, by and large? And keep in mind, as per usual, whatever you can most easily defend, go with that. And as you'll see, because of the nature of the way we address this in the topic, there's a lot more evidence on the successful side. You might disagree with that, but if it's easier for you to make the argument that they were successful based on, because we focus a lot on the accomplishments of the progressives, just go with that as your answer. So looking at just some examples of ways that they were successful and ways that they were not successful, lessons 2, 3, and 5 have a lot of examples of successes. We can look at different legislation that was passed, maybe court cases, regulations, et cetera, et cetera. And 5 is just a whole list of things within the federal government for those 3 presidents and their attempts to reform. 2 and 3, particularly women's issues like the 19th Amendment, also include some successes there too. So we can use things like the Keating-Owens Act, the Food and Drug Administration, the 19th Amendment, some of those election reforms like referendums and secret ballots and so forth, or the fact that they broke up trusts, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of different things that you can draw upon from that. Just make sure you can explain it, tie it together as an explanation of why they were successful, and make sure your thesis reflects those particular arguments that you're going to make. And so it's not enough to say, for example, they reformed elections. How does reforming elections make society more fair? In what ways did they do that, right? They broke up trusts. How is that making things more fair? Well, it means that smaller businesses can now have a better chance of competing. And then give a specific example like the Standard Oil Trust or the Northern Securities Trust. On the not successful side, this one will take a little bit more digging if you want to make this argument, and it's not because it's factual that the progressives were more successful. It's just that we focus on the big changes that they made, which lends itself better to making the successful argument. But on the not successful side, lesson 2 has some examples of ways that their successes were limited. That might be a better way of putting it, that their success was limited. And 4 is a really good example of a major failing within the progressive movement, and that's their failure to address issues of discrimination and civil rights. So some examples that we could draw upon is many progressives believed in social Darwinism, which was a racist belief. A lot of their laws, for example, child labor laws, were overturned by the court. So one of the things you'll find is you'll see a success, but then the court rules it unconstitutional. So you could make an argument that progressives were kind of overreaching with some of the things that they did, and that's why the court had to sort of pull them back from it. The income tax is not necessarily a failure. I mean, it was a success, and this is what the progressives were going for. But you could, make an argument about income tax maybe being unfair, or something to that effect. Looking forward, maybe a little bit from that. The continuation of lynchings, and the NAACP is not a failing of the progressives. It's a indication that the progressives failed to address race issues, because the NAACP, African Americans and other people, whites and other people of color, formed the NAACP because progressives weren't generally addressing race issues. So that in and of itself isn't a failure. It's actually some progress in that area, but it's the fact that it wasn't done by progressives that could lead to the argument that progressives were not successful or their successes were limited. Make sure, definitely do not forget 4 arguments, not 3. Okay, so you need 4 arguments. You need to make sure it's clear why this is an indication of a success or a failure, and any specific evidence that you can include, specific names of legislation or groups or whatever. That's important as far as building upon your argument that you're making. I'll let my clock run out here. All right. So taking the successful side, progressives were largely successful at making a more fair society. And if we look at some of those examples that we used in your reasoning, your actual argument piece of the thesis will vary depending on what evidence you're using to support it. What are your reasons? You want to put those together into the argument. So you want to start with your reasons, then formulate the actual argument part of the thesis. And based on some of the things I listed, I would give the example that they passed laws and amendments, right? That was one of the ways that they succeeded. If we argue the other side, that they were unsuccessful at making society fair, we can look at the fact that laws were struck down and they failed to address racism and discrimination. Okay, so if we turn those into some beginnings of paragraphs, and you can use these to start your paragraphs if you want. Here's my context statement. In the early 20th century, progressives attempted to use the government to address the problems brought on by industrial capitalism, urbanization, and political corruption. All I did was take the first part of the prompt and just put the time period we're talking about, early 20th century. And of course we can use, because context is neutral, we can use the context for both the positive and the negative. So on the positive side, progressives were largely successful in bringing about a more fair society by passing laws and amendments that secured reform. Okay, that's the basic argument. So I know you're going to be laying out a bunch of reasons that will be laws, that will be amendments. On the negative side, progressives were largely unsuccessful in bringing about a more fair society because many of their reforms were struck down and they failed to address issues of racism and discrimination. So I know that this paragraph is going to focus on those laws that were seen as overreaching by the Supreme Court, and on the failure of progressives to address the issues that will be addressed by other groups like the Anti-Defamation League, the Mutualistas, the NAACP, Urban League, and so forth. Okay? So don't forget 4 arguments. Don't forget your context. And remember, you need a counterclaim, and that counterclaim needs to be refuted. So take an argument from the other side. If you're arguing the positive, what's an argument on the negative side? And make sure your refutation addresses that argument specifically. Don't just give me another reason why your side is correct. Actually refute the argument from the other side. Good luck. Oh, yes, I forgot. One last thing before I go. This time around, I'm going to ask you guys to type your paragraph in a Google Doc, which I think many of you are a little bit more comfortable and familiar with, and then upload that or attach that file to the assignment in Google Classroom, rather than having you type it directly into Progress Book, because in Google Classroom I can put in a rubric, and when I mark that off, you can more clearly see where you did and did not get points so that you can improve on your next paragraph. Now I'm done.